Can Israel successfully navigate a war on two fronts in the middle of an election season? Or will it succumb to petty politics? And will the U.S.-Israel alliance survive the aftermath? This is The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. Israel's heading towards elections, and we've seen a numerous amount of politicians going full force in messaging, mergers, ads, campaigns, and political swipes at their opponents. However, the fighting in the north against Hezbollah has only increased, as well as the IDF activity in the Gaza Strip, leaving people wondering where politicians' heads are really focused. Are they going to be able to navigate this war and do what is needed, or is it all hands on deck for the next election? But most importantly, how do the Israeli people feel about this? Do they have higher trust in the institutions, or do they think that the government is going to simply buy time? And most interestingly, how does this affect diaspora Jews and the unbreakable bond between Israel and the US? To discuss this, we're joined by Yisrael Klitsner, a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, as well as the former Diaspora Affairs Advisor for Naftali Bennett when he was Prime Minister, and formerly the Director of Strategic Engagement at AIPAC AIEF. Yisrael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we got a lot to talk about. It's a very exciting period for me. Israel is kind of getting back into like the sway of its really big political discourse, which I love. I think it's much more exciting than talking about war. Not that there isn't a lot to talk about on the war front, but I think this is like good Israel news to cover. So
an interesting thing to find exciting, but I like it. That's a positive spin on what is bound to be an ugly
maybe after
cycle.
2.5 years of war, I'm just so jaded and looking for anything else to talk about. So Israeli, since basically the possibility of Knesset being dissolved has been brought up, politicians have done like a full 180, gone full force into like this campaigning mode and all these political gestures, mergers here and there. I don't want to go into like all of them because there's a lot happening and it's going to be changing at a rapid pace. But what I think is very interesting that we want to continue to check the pulse on is the kind of discourse that's going around in the political scene. So obviously, while the topic of October 7th never really left public discourse, it seems, and we saw this earlier this week with Lieberman, he's really full force on the rhetoric of the October 7th government. And we see that, this is at the top of the messaging, and they're really focusing hard on like the responsibility, probe, etc. So is this going to be like the opposition's main strategy? I'm sure it'll be a key component no matter where you cut it, and same thing for the government. They're gonna have to try to square the circle. But
exactly.
Is the opposition in all of its fronts going to go into the October 7th government, or are there other routes that they're probably going to go through?
I think, as in almost every other Israeli election cycle, security. It's right in stark contrast to what we have in the U.S., where it's the economy stupid.
Right.
Here, it's the security stupid.
Yeah.
That is going to be point A, point B, point C, and point D. After that, maybe we'll see a few other issues trickle in, but even those issues I see being peripheral to the issue of security. So, for example, ordinarily, we would consider the draft bill to be a religion and state matter.
Right.
But since October 7th and the desperate need for manpower in the IDF, that has obviously made its way into the national security apparatus.
Right.
And really at the forefront of the conversation of what it means to be a secure state. I think maybe some of the North American audiences, North American Jews, certainly oftentimes forget or maybe miss the fact that in Israel, security doesn't only mean whether you're hawkish or dovish.
Right.
It means when I send my kid to the IDF, what does the immediate impact look like? How much of the burden am I going to carry? I have 4 children. I'm thinking about this right now. What is that going to look like in the near to immediate future? My parents thinking about me. How long am I going to be a reservist for? Am I going to have to serve in perpetuity for 300 days on average? Not 300, but at this rate, we're talking at least 150 days. So people are still serving half the year, well into their 30s and into their 40s, which is decimating the Israeli economy. But again, going back to that same question of carrying an oversized burden on your back. So I think that's at the forefront, and that's why both opposition and coalition are going to try to spin the narrative of who was successful in both staving off the after effects of October 7th, right? So handling the Gaza question in a proper manner. Bibi's going to tell his story. The opposition is going to tell theirs. And as an aside, I think the opposition is certainly going to throw as a heavy weight into that battle the question of whether or not we should have a national inquiry into this, and have that front and center. But the coalition is going to try to tell a story of here are the benchmarks. Here are the successes that we've had until this point.
Changing the face of the Middle East,
Changing the face of the Middle East. I think Bibi is still certainly holding out hope, and I know we wanted to get to the Iran question a little bit later in the conversation, but I think he's still holding out hope that there is going to be some ripple effects from the Iran handling into the domestic scene.
Right.
And enable him to tell a better story about how he handled this war from A to Z. But certainly as it looks right now, and as we see in our JPPI polls that are consistent over time, there's definitely a slippage both in how the opposition to Bibi before October 7th and how the coalition supporters have been viewing Bibi's marks as success rates. There's a slow and steady decline in that regard.
Right. So I do want to delve into like Iran and the war because it's relevant, it's pertinent, it's happening right now. But before I get that, I'm curious to see. So if we're on the topic of October 7th, obviously this isn't news to anyone. Really like a watershed moment in Israeli history. It's completely changed the equation on just about everything really. Recently in the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of either family members of former hostages or people who are helping with like the Hostage Families Forum or like the whole like the civilian protest deal effort entering politics.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if this resembles kind of like a switching of the old guard where parties are realizing now like when we consider people to come to our party, it's not about, this person was a director general here or this person has the experience with this and such, but like this is a person who lived through the disaster. I mean, we all lived through the disaster, but they lived through it the most. And so like these are like the kind of people who represent like the true, I've suffered through like the failures of what happens when, when Israel's not on the ball. So is this like a shift in kind of like, just like the Israeli like
priorities
pulse and priorities, and is it being well received? Because it's not just like they've all gone to the opposition.
Yeah.
Recently, Eitan Mo's father,
Sure.
right? He joined up with Smotrich, so it's on all sides of the spectrum. Is that being like? Is that kind of like blending in seamlessly? Is there opposition to that? Does that appear to be like the next natural step? Like what does that look like?
So I want to say two things about this. The first is maybe in addition to how I answered your first question, and that is to say that Israel has desperately been trying to deal with some of its deep fissures that have been ripping apart Israeli society since day one, since the founding of this country. Issues like religion and state, issues like what the judiciary in Israel is going to look like and the balance of powers, things, right? Think about this for a second. About 70% of Israelis agree that there should be public transportation on the Sabbaths. And yet that never makes it to the front line. So that goes back to the question of what priorities come to play come election time. And my point on this is that specifically with regards to your question of new blood and especially people who have been affected directly by the October 7th massacre, is that the way I see it is there's a direct conflict between two priorities, two Israeli priorities, distinct Israeli priorities. On the one hand, feeling secure, and how does one feel secure? By what they know, tried and true. I think there's a good reason for Bibi getting elected time and again, and that is people understand this is somebody who has seen it all. He's been on every public stage possible. He's been on every international forum possible. He's spoken to world leaders at eye level time and again, and that speaks to them. And in direct conflict to that, there is also a deep need, especially after October 7th, not only to heal these internal divides. Again, just a reminder, we went to 4 elections in the span of 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Right? So there's still this deadlock. But to be able to heal in a way that the old guard probably won't be able to give us, to provide that type of support at this difficult time. So I see those conflicts coming to head in these elections. I do think it's interesting to note that the parties, right, the established parties, so-called the establishment. So you mentioned Smotrich. Certainly, Bibi is going to try to bring some of these people into his ranks. We're definitely seeing this on the oppositional parties, certainly with Gadi Eisenkot, but also with Naftali Bennett. Taking Yonatan Shalev, for example, somebody who built an entire persona after October 7th to say this is what we're all about is a new wave and energy of young Israelis that are bringing a different future after October 7th, but it's the establishment that's bringing them into the forefront,
Right.
To try and merge this conflict, to say you can get both.
Right.
I think that's what the calculus is for some of these political machinators, some of these political figures that are thinking about this strategically. But I think for the average voter, the conflict still exists, meaning there still is this deep-rooted need for, because it is tainted, right?
Right.
If you join a party now that is of the establishment, that is tainted, as I mentioned, by that pre-October 7th direct impact to bringing us to that calamitous moment, then your hands are dirty.
Right.
And yes, it helps to try and bridge that gap by bringing in these new people, but that stain is still there. So I have my doubts on just how impactful that'll be, but I definitely understand why it's being done.
I see. So interestingly, obviously October 7th is like this hot button issue that we can't just simply ignore, but at the same time, we are currently tied up in other conflicts. So I guess, what do you think takes precedent in like getting restitution and final like resolution for the October 7th issue, including a probe and people taking responsibility, or the current conflicts that we're in? Because I could see how people might be, upset with the current government, but at the same point apprehensive to kind of do a complete switch when the North is getting pounded and we don't know if we're going to go back to Iran in any moment, and they don't know if like someone else would be able to handle that. So how do you think that's going to affect voters?
I think the Israeli weakness is also its strength. And I'll give the perfect example. Immediately after October 7th, there was about 120% enlistment into the IDF. People coming, including myself. I came back from Pittsburgh, took the first flight I could get on to rejoin my unit and get into Khan Yunis and join the fight. When the going gets rough, Israelis know that the flag is calling them, and they know to answer that call. And we've seen that time and again. I could also go back to examples in the past with rounds of conflict with Hamas in Gaza, where that was the case as well. So every time there is a major event in Israeli society that needs everybody to sort of set aside everything else that's happening, they do it. And I see this again as Israelis' both strength and its weakness. Why is it its weakness as well? Because I think certain politicians know to tap into that and take advantage of it. And what I see for these coming elections is exactly that, is tugging on that sentiment, on what it means to get called to the flag on existential matters here in Israel. I think that's going to be harped on quite a bit, and
we've seen in
potentially,
some of your polls that like at the beginning of these kind of minor, like the beginning of these conflicts, every time we start around with Iran, for example, like Netanyahu's approval kind of goes up, or like trust in institutions
yes,
go up, and then they
exactly,
slowly go back down.
exactly, right. As the war lingers, you see more fatigue,
Right.
and certainly if there are no clear objectives, then there's no clear strategy, and there's no exit plan. All those things are true, but then
Right.
when reemerged and submitted into the Israeli life cycle in full swing, that brings it back to the forefront, and
Right.
and that's what creates that sentiment and that willingness to say, everything else aside, we need to all come together right now and
Right.
and answer the call.
In my opinion, this is definitely going to be a more interesting election cycle than all the previous like
Yeah,
rapid rounds.
I agree.
And it'll be interesting seeing how everything plays out. Now, while it's not the most important factor, obviously, I think Israelis should vote for like Israel and like the best interests of Israel. And this is by no means the most. This shouldn't ultimately sway the way anyone votes. I do want to talk about and observe how the current events in Israel and the decisions being made in Israel, governmental or otherwise, affect the relation with diaspora Jews.
Sure.
This is something that you guys write about extensively.
Yeah.
And it's something our readers want to know. It's not just like a loose link. Like Israel and the Jewish people are bound together. That's all you really do about it, and it does imply on them. So this is what I really want your takes on. I think there's a few key incidents that come to my mind.
Yep.
If there's anything else that comes to your mind, but for example, I think the one that most people will be familiar with is Ben-Gvir's little stint, where after they stopped the flotilla activists, he uploaded this video of him kind of chastising them and taunting them very proudly. So I'm sure within his own base that probably boosted his popularity. I'm sure they love that.
Yep.
He won't apologize. He thinks it's great. Interestingly enough, now that elections are a possibility, we see for the first time in like a very long time Sar and Netanyahu speaking out against him. But this was also like a diplomatic storm. All the country, a bunch of countries,
and yet
really,
they remain in his coalition.
yes, of course, because I think we could all say, despite all odds, this government has lasted a lot longer than it probably would have in normal circumstances. But like outside of Israel, this was a catastrophe. Like this was not received well whatsoever.
Yeah.
So how has that implied on Jews, or like affected their view of Israel, their view of Ben-Gvir, their view of the government? Like what does this affect on them?
Itamar Ben-Gvir has single-handedly dealt Israel many, many, many blows.
Yeah.
Certainly on the diplomatic arena, and we saw the fallout with that, with the European countries calling for conversations. All the ambassadors, the Israeli ambassadors, immediately after the unfortunate event that you just mentioned. But I think even worse than the event that you just stated in the flotilla is the death penalty that he brought to the Knesset, where it's a lopsided. For our detractors out there that want to find reasons to call Israel an apartheid state, when they see a law that
or in
applies,
my opinion, non-democratic anymore.
non-democratic, that applies to Jews and not to non-Jews,
Yeah.
This is just awful across the spectrum. It causes us so much harm and so much damage, and to minimize this to only being about Ben-Gvir, I think is a mistake. Bibi single-handedly made Ben-Gvir who he is. Bibi sat Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the same room and made them not leave that room, despite their hatred for one another, until they struck a deal that would make it amenable enough for both of them to run together in a joint list,
Right.
ensuring that Bibi's bloc would be able to emerge victorious in the last elections right before October 7th, leading them to survive until now. And the very fact that they still survive till this time as a coalition, again, is a testament to it doesn't matter. It almost doesn't matter which statements come out of Gideon Sa'ar's mouth or Bibi's mouth for in that regard as well, because they're keeping this alive.
Right.
They are feeding the animal. They are making this beast what it is, right? And it keeps growing.
No, 100%.
And the effect of this, certainly on North American Jewry, but also global Jewry, and as I mentioned before, on Israel's diplomatic status, cannot be understated. There's a catch-22 here, or a chicken and the egg situation.
Yeah.
And that is when I go to the U.S., for example, and try to explain to my dear friends in the Pittsburgh JCC and their audiences that there's a difference between Israeli policy, a government policy, and who Israel is as a nation, right? What Israel is as a nation. And without making that distinction, you get yourself in trouble. You potentially even shift over to the altogether anti-Israel / anti-Semitic zone. You got to be careful there. But that argument becomes all the more difficult when Israel keeps electing the same prime minister in Bibi Netanyahu, and Bibi Netanyahu keeps creating these
like platforming
these platforms.
Other, yeah.
So I definitely think this got much worse since Bibi entered into or created this coalition that is by far Israel's most extreme government in its history, which I think is incredibly unfortunate because it came immediately after the government that I was part of, advising Naftali Bennett on Diaspora Affairs, where we had for the first time ever a partnership with Mansour Abbas, who said, let's be pragmatic about this. Let's enter into a new way of conducting politics. Yair Golan was part of that, right? There were many others who entered into this that weren't necessarily ideological partners, but they said we can set our differences aside for the sake of making Israel the best version of itself.
I keep hearing that
feels like it's
Hamas
the opposite. Sorry.
Yeah. Not actually. No, for sure. As in, I'm not saying like the rift in like Israel and diaspora relations is solely on Ben-Gvir. Absolutely not. I think that's just the most recent, easiest to pin, most recognizable incident.
Yeah.
I do want to ask before going on to like the next incident and how it affects you. You talked earlier about like measures that diaspora Jews have to take. So I was wondering if you could like pontificate on that. Like what physically are diaspora Jews having to do?
Look, I speak to my close friend, Rabbi Aaron Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, and he tells me the unbelievable number of how many, in dollar amount, that he has to spend on security every single year. And he's not an anomaly. This is the growing trend across synagogues, across Jewish community centers, across every part of Jewish life, certainly if it's visible, is this desperate need for security. The JFNA just had this huge fly-in from all over the country for individuals to come to Washington, D.C. and lobby for a bill that would help them get greater federal funding for this exact purpose. It is dire. And again, to have this disconnect between what happens here and what happens there, that just can't be done anymore. That case cannot be made.
Right.
And that's why I think we really need to keep our finger on the pulse, not only here in Israel on what's happening internally, but also on what's happening there in the United States, and certainly what's happening in the Jewish community, but also for the Jewish community in the United States to have their finger closely on the pulse of what's happening here in Israel so that they can be ready for what's coming. I won't get into the question of, I think it's a complicated one, but I won't get into the question of whether or not the Israeli government should take into account what what the ripple effect of their decisions, their policy decisions here are going to be outside of the country.
My opinion, whatever, that, if on the one hand Israel wants to tout its representation of Jews around the world and count on the support of Jews around the world, it should definitely consider them at least. I feel like there's a disconnect, but that's another episode. In a different way, not in the way of disagreeing with like Israel policy and like the war in Gaza, so we justify attacks, these kinds of things, but like in a very different way, a topic that still does have implications on diaspora, that at least Jews in the U.S., is the war in Iran.
Yep.
Because it kind of has like a whole different set of parameters. It's less of a, there is a bit of still this kind of like policy of like, oh, America first, we don't want to get into foreign wars.
Yep.
Versus like, this is a just war or not. But for the average American, we do see that like the, closing the Strait of Hormuz affects oil, so like energy prices, all these things like
gas prices.
This is
everyday life. Yeah.
This is negatively affecting people around the world in ways that aren't just like, it's not just a moral quandary. It it literally affects them in tangible ways. So in that way, there are people who are against Israel for a whole different set of parameters, and I'm sure also Jews in America, even Jews in Israel, the conflict in Iran, it's not so clear cut, because like you can agree that the regime is bad, and especially if you live in Israel, you're in the splash zone. But at the same time, you wonder if it's being done in the most effective way, if we're really achieving anything, if it's worth all of these like deep costs, and it is eventually like pushing people away. And we see this in American politics. We see how Congress is constantly trying to curb with like the resolution. Thomas Massey just lost his election, but he's super against the influence of the Israel lobby in America. So for, I'd say, almost a completely different set of parameters, this is also affecting the U.S.-Israel alliance. So on the Iran metric, how is this affecting Jews?
Affecting Jews all over the world immeasurably. There are many things to say here. I'll begin by, prior to October 7th, I think there was a pretty solid bipartisan support for Israel. Yes, there are caveats. Certainly, the younger generation has been shifting over time, further and further away from support for Israel. But the, I would say, classic democratic stance was ardently pro-Israel, and certainly the classic Republican was so as well. We've moved into an area, and the Iran question is not helping in this regard, where the Republican Party is basically split now, where the need to now view the U.S.-Israel relationship through the lens of quid pro quo. Where is this relationship, right? We're beyond only talking about values and a value-based system. Where does it align? Because I would make the claim there it's pretty easy to tell that story, or was at least in the recent past. But we've moved into the zone on the Republican side of needing to really state our case of where this relationship is helping and aiding and abetting their bottom line. You mentioned people's wallets when they're going to the gas station. Like, yeah, that's 100%. That's where it starts. But we need to extrapolate from that a much larger story of how this is working in the American favor. That's one. Two, I would say that President Trump, while he had great support here in Israel, JPPI polls are also showing that there's a bit of a dip there as well. Not huge, but it's a dip. It started off well, but I think Israelis and people around the world, but certainly people living in the United States, where he presides over them as president, understand that this is not the most stable governance that one would receive. And that upon entry into a certain pathway, you're not necessarily going to exit from it in the same way that you came in. Right? So, for example, the Gaza Board of Peace. Nobody's
deal
talking.
itself.
Nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
We don't even know what's happening there, right? I know of somebody who's been in Egypt working on this for the past few months, but nothing is making the headlines. There's no significant headway being made there.
Right.
So there's a standstill. There are many indicators right now that we are heading into a similar situation vis-a-vis Iran, where maybe we'll get some sort of resolution on the Straits of Hormuz, which were never really Israel's prerogative to begin with.
Right.
On the question of Iran's long-term nuclear enrichment program, on whether or not the regime is going to stay in place, what was seen to be a real question mark leading into this.
Almost not part of the discussion anymore.
This is shifting further away from the center stage. And again, going into that very strange and scary zone of standstill. As an aside, Israel is, I would say, at expert level in the standstill. That has been our modus operandi for many, many years, which is to say, how do we reach a certain status quo, right? We launched the Oslo Accords saying we're going to try to reach some sort of resolution, two-state solution, maybe down the line, but let's try to keep it. And then we got stuck
in the water,
in this status quo on the Temple Mount. Everybody's in love with that status quo, even though obviously Ben-Gvir is trying to mess with it. No, but I'm saying the Israeli mindset, at least on the policy level, has been there. Yeah. But after October 7th, the Israeli mindset is no longer there. But now I think we've come to a collision course with a willingness for some form of status quo on the American side, and where that meets Israel, where that meets Israeli policymakers, where that meets the Israeli people is in a difficult place, to say the least. In addition to that, the domestic American political response to the Trump handling of the Iran question, I think is also really moved many, many Americans away from us, not to mention American Jews away from the Israel. When American Jews see largely voting Democrat and largely highly antagonistic to President Trump, when they see this vast support for almost everything President Trump does and says here in Israel, they do not take kindly to that. That hits in a sore spot, in a very soft belly of North American Jewry, and that is that takes time to heal, and also to bridge, right? How do you explain why it is that the Israeli body politic is following the Trump doctrine almost with eyes closed and blindfolded, saying, take us where you want to take us. There are reasons, and I think there are plenty of legitimate reasons for it, but that doesn't negate the fact that this is very problematic for our brothers and sisters living in the United States.
So I think for my final question, because we only have a little time left, is, a lot of politics is really about messaging. So if there are reasons for why Israel is basically, blindly following Trump and going along as well, he's essentially, dictating ceasefires for us at this point, if we'll be quaint. Do you think that Israel's doing enough in this messaging arena to try to mend this bridge? Is Israel showing diaspora Jews that they're seen and that we're considering you and this is part of it? Because I would argue not so much. I think on the other hand, there's been a few incidents recently, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yisrael Leiter, said a few things like J Street is a cancer, that Bernie Sanders isn't really a Jew, which criticize them all you want. I think that's kind of level of inflammatory rhetoric that, aside from the fact that I think is beyond the scope of the job and what should be said, I don't think it helps mend this bridge. I think it kind of helps the other way. So I would say, do you think Israel is taking this existence of a bridge seriously, or it's such a low priority?
So we have a project at JPPI dealing with Israel's public image and trying to really take a wide perspective look at the ecosystem and how it operates / doesn't. And the feedback that we immediately got from our partners in the U.S. that were helping support this project was, first, do no harm, right? That comes across the board. Is please don't get in our way. Like we don't need much more than that.
Yeah.
You want to talk about how you tell Israel's story better? Fine. but before you get to that point where you're on the positive end of the spectrum, don't be on the negative end. Please stop. And they are correct. They are absolutely correct. We spoke at length about Ben-Gvir. That's a primary example, but there are many, many more. And when you talk about what Leiter said to Jewish leaders in Washington, speaking about J Street in that manner, but also just
and like on the behalf of Israel.
Exactly, he is a representative. There's a word in Hebrew that has zero translation in English, and that is mamlachtiut. You're supposed to be, when you're representing the state, the mamlacha, the kingdom, you need to be above petty politics. You absolutely have to. And in so doing, he was doing the exact opposite. I recently put together a panel for the Pittsburgh JCC with Jeremy Ben-Ami and Brett Stevens.
Okay.
And when I prepped for it, and I spoke to both Brett and Jeremy, I said to each of them, I think you're going to agree on much more than you're going to disagree on. So let's hone in for a second on what you disagree on so that we can make that clear to the audience, and then also cover where all the overlap exists, because there's a lot that binds us together. Mm-hmm. And when the basis of that conversation is we are all Zionists, we believe with every fabric of our being that Israel has the right to exist, and not only the right to exist, to thrive and be all it can be. That's the core, right? That's where you begin the conversation. And yes, there are differences of opinion. And yes, I can still believe after that J Street has caused a lot of harm to the U.S.-Israel relationship as I see it. But I can also engage in conversation, in civil conversation and discourse with J Street. And I can also understand that ultimately we want something similar. And that's really, really important. And I just want to say about Yechiel, like, I think it's really unfortunate because he's stepping right into the petty politics that is being played here in Israel and playing to the base. Right? I don't think he was really talking to North American Jews. I think he specifically wanted that statement to come out so that it pandered to the base of Likud voters here in Israel.
I see. I agree 100%. And I think there are obviously more pertinent issues in Israel currently because we're in all these conflicts than just like the Israel-diaspora relations. But regardless of how the next election goes, I hope once the election is set and done, I at least hope that whatever the next government looks like, they have the space to recognize that this is getting worse and this is something that's worth putting effort into and investing in keeping, and it's not a given and it shouldn't be treated as a given. But I guess we'll see what they end up doing with it.
I really, really hope so. It is desperately needed. I think that even if we don't have a wide national unity government emerging out of these elections, and even if we don't have a replica of the government that I was part of with Mansour Abbas, spanning Mansour Abbas to Naftali Bennett and everything in between, the reason I'm relatively optimistic stepping into these elections is that I do think it's going to be difficult to be worse than this government. That might sound pessimistic, but I think it's a positive. It's a net positive, at least for now. But what I'm pessimistic about is that, unfortunately, I think it is too soon to begin the healing process. The desperately needed healing process of going back to those same conversations, right? Again, a crazy reminder of having hundreds of thousands of people going out on a weekly basis to protest who we are.
Right.
In the spectrum of a Jewish and democratic state, where does it lean heavier? How are we resolving all these fissures that I spoke about earlier?
We just left that in the middle.
We need it. We desperately need it. And I don't think we're there. I think this moment in time, because it is so frayed by everything else that is happening, and because, as you mentioned in the outset of this conversation, it is an election during a war, the longest war in Israel's history by far, which is also not a healthy thing for a tiny little country. That makes it all the more difficult, and that's why I'm pessimistic on that note. But I actually do think that we will get a better result than we got the last time.
I tend to agree, but I'm also very excited to see what JPPI is going to put out to see how other people feel. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Thank you so much for joining this week's episode. We really hope you enjoyed it. But as we discussed, this election season in the middle of wartime is only going to get more and more intense. So make sure in the meantime to go to jpost.com to stay up to date.